A raging bison herd trapped a widow and her infant in the open plains. But a Dakota warrior dragged them to safety, and she learned he ruled the wild's Dakota territory. Late summer 1878. The grass stretched endless and golden beneath, a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the earth whole. Heat shimmered above the prairie in waves, distorting the horizon into something dreamlike and unreal. Jane Kensington walked alone through that vastness, her infant son Charles bundled against her chest in a sling made from her late husband's shirt. Her boots were worn through at the soles, the leather cracked and peeling, exposing blistered skin beneath. Her dress, once a modest gray cotton, now bore the stains of travel, dust, and desperation. The hem was torn where it had caught on thorns 3 days prior. Her hair, once neatly pinned, hung in loose tangled waves down her back. She had been walking for 3 days. Her husband, Thomas Kensington, had died 2 months prior. Fever took him in the night, sudden and merciless, his body burning hot one moment and cold the next. They had been heading west to join a settlement near the Yellowstone River, a place Thomas swore would give them land, opportunity, a future for their son. He had spoken of it with such certainty, such hope, that Jane had believed him completely. But the wagon broke an axle 50 miles from nowhere, the wood splintering with a crack that echoed across the empty plains like a gunshot. The other families in their small caravan couldn't wait. Winter was coming. Supplies were short. Children were hungry. They left her 2 days' worth of hardtack, a canteen of water, and hollow promises to send help from the next settlement. No help came, so Jane walked. Charles, 8 months old, had her eyes pale blue and searching, and his father's dark hair soft as duck down. He didn't cry much anymore. That worried her more than if he had screamed. She sang to him softly as they moved, old hymns her mother taught her back in Pennsylvania, though her voice cracked from thirst and exhaustion. The canteen had run dry that morning. She had tilted it back, shaking out the last precious drops onto her fingertip for Charles to suck. Now it hung empty at her hip, mocking her with its lightness. The sun beat down without mercy. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue felt thick and foreign in her mouth. She stumbled over uneven ground, caught herself, kept moving. 1 foot in front of the other. That was all she could manage. 1 step, then another. Then another. She didn't let herself think about how far she had to go, or whether she would make it. She only thought about the next step. It was near midday when she saw them. At first, they were only a dark smudge on the horizon, a shadow that rippled and moved like a single living thing. Jane squinted against the sun, shading her eyes with one trembling hand. The heat made everything waver and dance. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision. Then the sound reached her. A low rumble, deep and rhythmic, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. But the sky was clear, painfully bright and blue, without a single cloud. Her heart dropped. Bison, hundreds of them. Maybe more. A herd so vast it seemed to devour the land as it moved, their massive bodies surging forward in a slow, unstoppable tide. Dust rose in clouds around them, thick and choking, turning the air brown. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a vibration that traveled up through her legs and into her chest. She could feel it in her bones. Jane turned and ran. She clutched Charles tighter, one arm locked around him, the other pumping at her side. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her legs burned. Her vision blurred at the edges. There was nowhere to go. No trees, no rocks, no shelter of any kind. Just open grass and endless sky and the terrible growing roar of the herd behind her. The sound swelled, filling the world, drowning out thought. She stumbled, her boot catching on a clump of grass. She nearly fell, windmilling her free arm, catching herself at the last second. Charles whimpered against her chest, his tiny hands clutching at her dress. She kissed his head, tasted salt and dust in fear. Her lungs screamed for air. The thunder grew louder, closer. She could hear individual snorts now. The crack of hooves against hard earth. The low bellowing of the massive beasts. She risked a glance back. The herd had shifted direction. They were coming straight toward her. A wall of brown hide and horns and muscle, moving with the inevitability of an avalanche. There was no outrunning them. No escape. Jane's legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the tall grass, her body folding protectively around her son. She curled over him, making herself as small as possible, a human shield. She closed her eyes tight. She prayed. Not for herself. For Charles. That it would be quick. That he wouldn't suffer. That God would take him gently and forgive her for not being strong enough to save him. She whispered his name over and over like a prayer, like a promise. The ground shook violently. The roar became deafening, a physical force that pressed against her eardrums. She felt the heat of their bodies, smelled the wild musk of them, sharp and overwhelming. Dust filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs. She held Charles so tightly he cried out. A thin, desperate wail that tore at her heart. Then something hit her, not a bison, a man. Strong arms locked around her waist and yanked her sideways with brutal force. She gasped, eyes flying open. The world spun. She saw flashes of movement, brown hide streaked with dust, massive curved horns, a blur of muscle and fur passing so close she felt the wind of it against her face. The man dragged her across the ground, his grip unyielding, iron hard. Rocks and thorns tore at her dress, scraped her skin. Charles screamed, his voice high and terrified. Jane tried to speak but couldn't find air. Her chest burned. They hit something solid. A shallow depression in the earth, barely deeper than a ditch, a natural fold in the land. The man shoved her down into it, his body covering hers and the baby's completely. The herd surged over them. Hooves pounded inches from her head, so close she could see the caked mud on them, could feel the percussion of each impact like blows to her body. Dust choked her. The noise was apocalyptic, a wall of sound that obliterated thought, obliterated everything but raw animal terror. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe, could only feel the weight of the man above her, shielding them. His body a barrier between them and trampling death, and the frantic heartbeat of her son against her ribs. Proof that he was still alive. Then slowly the thunder faded. The herd passed, silence rushed in like a flood. So sudden and complete, it was almost painful. Jane lay still, gasping, coughing up dust. Her ears rang. Her whole body shook uncontrollably. Above her, the man shifted, lifting his weight carefully, slowly. She blinked up at him through the settling dust, her vision swimming. He was Dakota, tall and broad-shouldered, his skin bronzed by sun and wind, his face angular and striking. His hair was long and black, tied back with a strip of leather decorated with small blue beads. He wore buckskin leggings, well-made and supple, and a simple shirt of pale doeskin adorned with intricate beadwork at the seams and patterns of red and black. A knife hung at his belt in a beaded sheath. His face was serious, almost severe, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a pale line against darker skin. But it was his eyes that held her. Dark as night, steady and utterly calm, as if saving a woman and child from a stampede was no more remarkable than breathing. There was no fear in those eyes. No panic. Only certainty, he spoke. His voice was low and rough, shaped by a language she didn't know, the syllables fluid and unfamiliar. She stared at him, uncomprehending, her mind still frozen in the moment of terror. He tried again, this time in halting English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "You hurt?" Jane shook her head, still unable to find words. Her throat was raw. Charles wailed, his face red and streaked with tears and dust. She clutched him, her hands running over his small body frantically, checking for injuries. No blood, no breaks. Just terrified. She pressed her lips to his forehead and sobbed once, a single broken sound that escaped before she could stop it. The man stood, rising to his full height, which was considerable. He offered his hand. Jane hesitated, staring at it. His palm was broad, calloused, marked with small scars. She took it. His grip was firm, but not rough, and he pulled her to her feet easily, as if she weighed nothing. She swayed, dizzy, the world tilting. He steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, then stepped back immediately, giving her space, respecting her boundaries. "Water," he said, and gestured toward the horizon. She followed his gaze with difficulty, her eyes still stinging from dust. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, she saw a thin line of green cutting across the brown and gold of the plains, trees, a creek, water. Hope surged painfully in her chest. "Sharp as a knife. I can't," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "I can't walk that far. I've been walking for days. I have nothing left." He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from her face to Charles, taking in the baby's sunken cheeks, the way Jane trembled, barely able to stand. The man nodded once, as if making a decision. Without a word, he turned and whistled sharply, 2 short notes that carried across the plains. From beyond the low rise, a horse appeared. A painted mare, brown and white in irregular patches, lean and strong with intelligent eyes. She trotted to him and stood calmly as he took the reins, running a hand along her neck in greeting. He turned back to Jane and gestured to the horse. "You ride," he said simply. Jane stared. "I don't understand. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you." He didn't answer immediately. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone. Then he said quietly, "You need help." "That is enough." She had no choice. No strength left to refuse kindness, no matter how strange its source, no matter that this man was a stranger from a world entirely different from her own. She walked to the horse on trembling legs, each step an effort. The man helped her up, his hands respectful, careful of the baby, supporting her elbow and then her foot. Once she was seated, he handed her a waterskin from the saddle, the leather soft and worn smooth with use. She pulled the stopper with shaking fingers and drank deeply, the water cool and sweet, the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She gasped, then drank again, forcing herself to slow down. Then she gave Charles a few drops on her fingertip. He sucked greedily, whimpering for more. The man took the reins and began to walk, leading the horse toward the distant trees. His stride was long and easy, covering ground with effortless grace. Jane watched him, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere like something out of a dream, who had thrown himself between her and death without hesitation, without question. She didn't even know his name, didn't know where he was taking her, didn't know what he wanted from her, if anything. But she was alive. Charles was alive. That was all that mattered. "Thank you," she said quietly. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, his expression still unreadable. Then he nodded once and kept walking, his moccasins silent on the earth. They reached the creek as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose and deep purple. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones worn round by time. Cottonwood trees grew along the banks, their leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. Jane slid from the horse, her legs barely holding her, and knelt at the bank. She drank until her stomach ached, until she felt she might be sick. She wet a cloth from her bag and wiped Charles's face, his hands, his neck, whispering to him that they were safe now, that everything would be all right, that Mama was here. The man filled the waterskin, then moved upstream and knelt to drink himself, cupping water in his hands. When he returned, he built a fire with practiced efficiency, gathering dry grass and small sticks, arranging them in a careful structure. He struck flint against steel until sparks caught the kindling, then blew gently until flames crackled to life. Within minutes, a good fire burned. He took dried meat from a pouch at his belt, dark strips of jerky, and offered her a piece. She accepted it gratefully, tearing off small bits with her teeth and chewing slowly. It was tough and salty and delicious. "What's your name?" she asked after a while, her voice stronger now. He looked at her across the fire, flames dancing between them. "Shapa," he said. "Shapa," she repeated, testing the shape of it on her tongue. "I'm Jane Kensington. This is my son, Charles." Shapa nodded, his gaze moving to the baby. Charles had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted. "He is strong," Shapa said. "He's all I have left," Jane replied quietly. "My husband died 2 months ago. Fever. We were traveling to a settlement. But our wagon broke and the others left us behind." Shapa poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "You are far from any settlement," he observed. "I know," she said. "I thought I could walk there. I thought someone would come back for us. I was wrong on both counts. Why did you save us?" she asked after a moment. He was quiet for a long time. She thought he might not answer. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Then he spoke, his English slow but clear. "The herd does not see, does not choose. You were in the path. That is all. To let you die when I could act would be wrong. But you risked your life. Yes, for strangers." He met her eyes across the fire. "All people are strangers until they are not," he said simply. Jane held his gaze. There was something in his face, a gravity, a weight that spoke of loss and endurance, and choices made in the face of impossible circumstances. She recognized it because she carried it too. That heaviness in the chest, that weariness in the bones. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time, meaning it with every part of herself. He inclined his head slightly. "You rest now. Tomorrow, I take you to Fort. 3 days' ride, maybe less if weather holds." "Fort?" Her heart clenched. "How far?" "Fort Randall. On the Missouri River. 3 days, maybe 4. She closed her eyes. 3 days. She could manage 3 days. She had to. There was no other choice that night. She lay by the fire with Charles curled against her, his small body warm and trusting, his breathing deep and even. She listened to the creek murmuring over stones and the distant cry of a night bird, haunting and beautiful. Across the flames, Shapa sat with his back against a cottonwood tree, knife in hand, eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight. He did not lie down. He did not sleep. He watched, a silent guardian between her and the wild. Between her and whatever dangers lurked in the night, for the first time in months. Jane Kensington closed her eyes and felt something other than fear. She felt safe. The next morning dawned cool and clear. Mist clung to the creek, rising in ghostly tendrils as the sun broke over the plains, turning everything gold and pink. Jane woke to the smell of smoke and roasting meat. Shapa crouched by the fire, turning a rabbit on a makeshift spit, the fat dripping and sizzling. He glanced at her as she sat up, Charles still asleep in her arms. His small fist clutched in her dress. "Eat," Shapa said, offering her a portion of the meat wrapped in a piece of cloth. She accepted it, too hungry to protest or stand on ceremony. The meat was tough but flavorful, seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize. She chewed slowly, savoring every bite, feeling strength seep back into her limbs. Charles woke and fussed, his face scrunching up. She fed him from her breast, turning slightly away for modesty. Shapa paid no attention, busy packing his saddlebags and checking the mare's tack. When they finished, he helped her onto the horse again. This time he swung up behind her, his presence solid and warm at her back. She stiffened instinctively, unused to such proximity to a man who wasn't her husband. But he kept a respectful distance, his hands on the reins, not on her, his body careful not to press too close. They rode east, toward the rising sun. The land rolled gently, covered in buffalo grass and dotted with sage and wildflowers in shades of yellow and purple. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals. Once, they passed a herd of pronghorn, the animals bounding away in graceful leaps, impossibly fast. Jane watched it all with a strange sense of dislocation, as if she had stepped out of her old life and into something entirely new. Something she didn't yet understand. "You know this land well," she said after a while. "Yes," Shapa replied, his voice close to her ear but not intrusive. "I was born here. My people have walked these plains for more generations than can be counted. Where are they now?" "Your people?" His silence was answer enough. Jane felt the weight of it, the grief unspoken but present. She didn't press. She understood loss, understood the weight of things that couldn't be spoken aloud without breaking something inside. By midday, they stopped to rest and water the horse. Jane laid Charles on a blanket in the shade of a scraggly juniper, while Shapa checked the mare's hooves, picking out small stones with careful fingers. The baby cooed, reaching for the sky with tiny fists, his eyes tracking a butterfly that danced past. Jane smiled, touching his cheek, marveling that he could still find wonder after everything. "He is strong," Shapa said, glancing over. "He's all I have left of his father," Jane replied quietly. "All I have left of that life," Shapa nodded slowly. "Then you fight to keep him. You fight to keep yourself. That is what matters now." "I will," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They rode until dusk, the sun sinking behind them in a blaze of orange and red. Shapa made camp in a sheltered draw, protected from the wind. He built another fire, and they ate jerky and a handful of wild berries he had gathered along the way, small and tart. They sat in companionable silence, the quiet broken only by the pop of burning wood and Charles's occasional babbling. Jane found herself watching Shapa, this man who moved through the world with such quiet assurance. He wasted no motion, spoke no unnecessary words, yet his presence filled the space around him like a low, steady drumbeat. "Why do you live alone out here?" she asked. He looked at her, firelight dancing in his dark eyes, making them gleam. "I do not live alone," he said slowly. "The land is my companion. The sky, the rivers, the animals. They do not leave. They do not betray. They simply are." Jane considered this, turning the words over in her mind. "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted, and there was something in his voice, a crack in the armor. "But loneliness is different from being alone. One is a choice. The other is a condition." She understood that too. She had been lonely in her marriage sometimes, even with Thomas beside her. And she had been alone since his death, but not always lonely that night. As she lay beneath a blanket Shapa had given her, the wool rough but warm, with Charles sleeping peacefully beside her and the stars spread overhead in impossible numbers, Jane thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. A week ago, she had been a widow, lost and dying on the plains, certain she would never see another sunrise. Now she was traveling with a Dakota warrior who had saved her life, heading toward a fort and a future she couldn't yet imagine. She didn't know what lay ahead. Didn't know if the fort would welcome her, if she could find work, if she could build a life for Charles. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something fragile and precious stirring in her chest, hope. The fort rose from the plains like a promise carved from timber and stone. Fort Randall sat on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River, its wooden palisade walls weathered gray by wind and sun. Smoke curled from chimneys. The American flag snapped in the breeze. Jane could hear voices, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the whinny of horses, civilization. safety. Yet as they drew closer, she felt a strange reluctance tightening in her chest. Shapa had ridden mostly in silence for the past 3 days, speaking only when necessary, pointing out landmarks, warning her of uneven ground. But his presence had become oddly comforting. The steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, the warmth of his body at her back during cold mornings, the quiet competence with which he built fires and found water. She had grown accustomed to it. To him, now as the fort's gates came into view, she realized this strange journey was ending. Shapa reined the mare to a stop 50 yards from the entrance. He dismounted first, then helped Jane down. Charles fussed against her shoulder, startled by the sudden stillness. She patted his back absently, her eyes on the fort. Soldiers moved along the walls. A wagon rolled out through the gates, its wheels creaking. "You will be safe here," Shapa said. Jane turned to him. In 3 days, she had learned to read the small shifts in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he was concerned. Now his face was carefully neutral, but something flickered in his gaze. "Will you come inside?" she asked. He shook his head. "They do not welcome my people within their walls." "Not anymore, but you saved us. Surely they would understand. Understanding and welcome are not the same thing," he said quietly. Jane felt a sudden pang of something she couldn't name. Gratitude, yes, but something more. This man had given her 3 days of safety, had asked nothing in return, had treated her with more respect than most men she had known. And now he would simply ride away, back into the wilderness, alone. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice catching. "You do not need to thank me. You are alive. Your son is alive. That is enough." She reached into her bag and pulled out the only thing of value she still possessed, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She held it out to him. "Please, take this." Shapa looked at the locket, then at her face. He shook his head. "Keep it. Give it to your son when he is grown. Tell him his mother was strong." Tears pricked her eyes. She clutched the locket to her chest. "Will I see you again?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved past her to the fort, then back to her face. "The plains are wide," he said. "But paths cross when they are meant to." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. He swung back onto his horse in one fluid motion. The painted mare shifted, sensing his intention to leave. Shapa looked down at Jane one last time. "Be well, Jane Kensington," he said. "Be well, Shapa." She replied, her throat tight. He turned the horse and rode away, back toward the open plains, back toward the wild lands he called home. Jane stood watching until he disappeared over a rise, swallowed by grass and distance. Then she turned toward the fort, adjusted Charles in her arms, and walked through the gates alone. Inside, the fort bustled with activity. Soldiers drilled in the courtyard. Women hung laundry near a row of small cabins. Children chased each other between buildings, their laughter high and bright. Jane stood uncertainly just inside the gates, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her dress torn and filthy, her hair wild, her face sunburned and gaunt. A woman approached, middle-aged and sturdy, with sharp blue eyes and graying hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a simple brown dress and an apron stained with flour. "Lord have mercy," she said, taking in Jane's appearance. "Where did you come from, child?" "My wagon broke down," Jane said, her voice hoarse. "I've been walking. A man helped me. He brought me here." The woman's eyes narrowed. "What man?" "A Dakota warrior. His name was Shapa. He saved my life." The woman's expression shifted, something hard and disapproving settling over her features. "You traveled alone with a savage for 3 days?" Jane stiffened. "He wasn't a savage. He was kind. He protected us. Kind or not, you're lucky to be alive and untouched," the woman said briskly. Come with me. You need food and rest. I'm Mrs. Hartley. My husband is the quartermaster here." She led Jane through the fort to a small cabin near the western wall. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace. Mrs. Hartley bustled about, stoking the fire, heating water, bringing bread and cheese from somewhere. Jane sank into a chair, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. Charles whimpered, and she fed him mechanically, her mind still on the plains, on Shapa riding away. "You'll stay here tonight," Mrs. Hartley said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what's to be done with you. Do you have family? Anyone who can take you in?" "No," Jane said quietly. "My husband is dead. We were traveling to a settlement, but I have no one there." "No one anywhere." Mrs. Hartley's expression softened slightly. "Well, we'll sort something out. Fort's always in need of extra hands. Can you cook, so?" "Yes, both." "Good. We'll talk to the colonel in the morning."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
For now, rest. That night, Jane lay in the narrow bed with Charles beside her, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. She should have felt relieved. She was safe, fed, sheltered. But instead, she felt hollow, empty. She closed her eyes and saw Shapa's face, the quiet strength in it, the sadness he carried like a second skin. She wondered where he was now. If he was alone by a fire somewhere, looking at the same stars, she didn't sleep well. The next morning, Mrs. Hartley took her to meet Colonel Davison, a stern man with a gray mustache and hard eyes. He sat behind a desk in the headquarters building, looking her over as if assessing livestock. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, "I understand you've had quite an ordeal." "Yes, sir. Mrs. Hartley tells me you can cook and sew. We can use someone in the kitchens. You'll work 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. Room and board provided. Does that suit you?" It wasn't a question, not really. Jane nodded. "Yes, sir." "Thank you. Good, one more thing." His eyes narrowed. "I'm told you traveled here with one of the Dakota. I need to make something clear. Fraternizing with Indians is not tolerated at this fort. They are the enemy. We are at peace now, but that peace is fragile. Do you understand?" Jane's hands clenched in her lap. "He saved my life, sir. He asked for nothing in return. I don't care what he did. You're under our protection now, and you'll abide by our rules. Stay away from them. If any approach you, report it immediately. Are we clear?" She wanted to argue, to defend Shapa, to tell this cold-eyed man that he knew nothing about honor or kindness. But she had no power here, no voice. She needed this position. Charles needed food and shelter. So she swallowed her anger and nodded. "Yes, sir. We're clear. Dismissed." She left the office trembling with suppressed fury. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of work. Jane rose before dawn each day, reporting to the kitchens where she peeled potatoes, stirred massive pots of stew, kneaded bread until her arms ached. The work was endless and exhausting, but she didn't complain. Charles stayed with her, playing on a blanket in the corner while she worked. The other women in the kitchen, soldiers' wives mostly, were polite but distant. They whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. 3 days alone with a savage, one muttered. "Lord knows what happened. She seems respectable enough." Another replied doubtfully. "Still, you can't trust someone who'd let an Indian touch her." Jane ignored them. She had survived worse than gossip. She focused on her work, on Charles, on getting through each day. But at night, lying in her small cabin, she thought of the plains, of open sky and wind and the quiet presence of a man who had asked nothing of her, who had given everything. One afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival, Jane was hanging laundry behind the kitchens when she heard horses approaching. She glanced up, shading her eyes against the sun. A group of soldiers rode through the gates, and behind them, bound and on foot, walked 3 Dakota men. Their hands were tied. Their faces were stoic, expressionless. Blood stained one man's shirt. Jane's breath caught. She scanned their faces frantically, terrified she would see Shappa among them. She didn't. Relief and guilt flooded her in equal measure. Caught them hunting on posted land, one soldier said loudly, dismounting. Going to hold them overnight, send them back to the reservation in the morning. The Dakota men were led to a small building near the edge of the fort, little more than a shed with a heavy door. They went without resistance, without speaking. Jane watched until they disappeared inside, her heart aching. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing their faces, the quiet dignity in their silence. She thought of Shappa, wondered if this would be his fate one day, dragged into a fort and treated like an animal. The thought made her sick. Near midnight, she rose and dressed. Charles was sleeping soundly. She wrapped him carefully and carried him outside. The fort was quiet, most of the soldiers asleep. A single guard walked the walls. Jane moved through shadows, staying close to buildings, her heart pounding. She reached the shed where the Dakota men were held. No guards stood outside. They weren't considered dangerous enough to warrant one. She approached the door. Through gaps in the wood, she could see nothing. She knocked softly. No response. She knocked again. "Hello," she whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you," a voice came from inside, speaking Dakota. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was wary. "I'm a friend," she said quietly. "A man of your people saved my life. His name was Shappa. Do you know him?" Silence. Then a different voice, speaking English. "Shappa, yes, we know him. He is called the Silent Wolf among our people." Jane's breath caught. "Is he well? Is he safe? He lives alone in the old ways. He does not come to the reservation. The soldiers have not caught him." Relief washed over her. "I have food," she said. "Water, can I bring it to you?" Another long pause. "Why would you help us?" "Because helping is the right thing to do," Jane said simply. She hurried back to her cabin, grabbed bread and dried meat from her small stores, filled a water skin. She returned to the shed and passed the items through a gap near the ground. Hands reached out, taking them. "Thank you," the voice said quietly. "I'm sorry for what they've done to you." Jane whispered, "Your sorrow does not change it. But your kindness is noted." She returned to her cabin before anyone saw her, her hands shaking. She had broken the colonel's rules, had risked her position, perhaps her safety. But she couldn't regret it. The next morning, the Dakota men were released and sent away. Jane watched from a distance as they walked out through the gates, heading south toward the reservation. One of them glanced back, his eyes finding hers across the courtyard. He nodded once, so slightly she almost missed it. Then they were gone. Mrs. Hartley appeared at her elbow. "I hope you're not thinking foolish thoughts," she said sharply. "What do you mean?" "I saw you watching them. Those people are not your concern. You have a child to raise, a position to maintain. Don't throw it away on misplaced sympathy." Jane turned to face her. "It's not misplaced," she said quietly. "It's called human decency." Mrs. Hartley's lips thinned. "Human decency won't keep you fed and sheltered. Remember that." She walked away, leaving Jane standing alone. That evening, as Jane prepared supper in the kitchens, one of the soldiers came in, a young man named Private Cooper. He was barely 20, with freckles and nervous hands. "Mrs. Kensington," he said quietly, "can I speak with you?" Of course, he glanced around, making sure they were alone. "I heard what you did last night. Helping those Dakota men." Jane's stomach dropped. "I don't know what you mean. I was on wall duty. I saw you." "Don't worry," he added quickly, seeing her fear. "I'm not going to report you." I just wanted to say that what you did was brave. Most people here, they've forgotten that Indians are people too. My brother was killed by Lakota warriors 3 years ago, but I still know that not all of them are enemies. Some are just trying to survive, same as us." Jane stared at him, surprised. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to need friends if you keep acting on your conscience," he said simply. "And because I think you're right. We've taken everything from them. The least we can do is treat them like human beings. Thank you, Private Cooper." He nodded and left. Jane stood alone in the kitchen, tears stinging her eyes. She wasn't alone in her beliefs. That knowledge gave her strength. The autumn grew colder. Leaves turned gold and red, then fell. Jane settled into the rhythm of fort life, but she never felt at home. She did her work, cared for Charles, kept her head down. But every day, she looked toward the plains beyond the walls and wondered. Wondered if Shapa was out there somewhere. Wondered if he ever thought of her. Wondered if their paths would cross again. As he had said they might, one morning in late October, she woke to shouting. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. Soldiers were gathering near the gates, pointing and talking urgently. Jane pushed through the crowd, Charles on her hip. "What's happening?" she asked. "Hunting party spotted," someone said. "Dakota, just beyond the ridge," Jane's heart seized. She pushed closer, craning to see. In the distance, barely visible, were figures on horseback. 4, maybe 5. Too far to make out details. The soldiers were debating whether to pursue them. "They're on open land," Colonel Davison said. "Technically not breaking treaty." "Let them be." The figures disappeared over the ridge. The crowd dispersed, disappointed at the lack of action. Jane stood staring at the empty horizon, her heart still racing. Had Shapa been among them? She would never know. But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed with Charles sleeping beside her, she made a decision. She couldn't live like this forever, trapped behind walls, working herself to exhaustion, surrounded by people who saw the world in shades of us and them. She needed something more. Something true. She didn't know what that meant yet. Didn't know how to find it, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that her story with Shapa wasn't finished. Winter came early to the Dakota Territory that year. Snow fell in heavy curtains, transforming the plains into an endless white expanse. The fort grew quieter, more insular. Soldiers huddled close to fires. Supply wagons arrived less frequently. Jane's work in the kitchens intensified as they stretched provisions to last until spring. Charles, now nearly a year old, took his first wobbling steps across the cabin floor. And Jane wept with joy and sorrow both, wishing Thomas could have seen it. Wishing for things that could never be. It was mid-December when the fever came. It started with the children. Little Tommy Bradford, son of Sergeant Bradford, fell ill first. Then Mary Cooper, Private Cooper's niece. Within days, 6 children were sick, their small bodies burning with heat, their breathing shallow and labored. The fort's doctor, an aging man named Whitmore, did what he could, but his supplies were limited and his knowledge insufficient. 2 children died within the first week. Jane watched the grieving families with a heavy heart, clutching Charles tighter each night, terrified the sickness would find him. She boiled water obsessively, washed his clothes daily, kept him away from the other children. But fear was a constant companion, cold and suffocating. Then, on a bitter morning when the wind howled like wolves, Mrs. Hartley came to Jane's cabin. Her face was grave. "Mrs. Kensington, I need to speak with you." Jane's blood turned to ice. "What is it?" "The Simmons boy is very ill. Burning up. Dr. Whitmore says he needs a particular herb to break the fever, something that grows near water. He described it, but none of us know the plants out here well enough to find it in winter. What does this have to do with me?" Mrs. Hartley's expression was pained. "You traveled with that Dakota man. They know these lands, know the plants. If there's any way to contact him, to ask for help, we need to do it. I know the Colonel forbids fraternization, but this is a child's life. Jane stared at her. You want me to find Shapa? If you can. I know it's dangerous. I know it goes against orders. But Tommy Simmons is dying, and we're desperate. Jane's mind raced. Find Shapa in the middle of winter, in thousands of square miles of wilderness, with no idea where he might be. It was impossible, foolish, but the image of Tommy Simmons' mother, weeping over her son's bedside, rose in her mind. I'll try, Jane said quietly. Mrs. Hartley's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. Take whatever you need. I'll watch Charles while you're gone. No. Jane's voice was firm. Charles comes with me. I won't leave him. But the cold, the danger. He comes with me, Jane repeated. Mrs. Hartley nodded reluctantly. Then God go with you. Within an hour, Jane had prepared. She borrowed a horse from the stables, a sturdy gelding named Rust. She packed blankets, food, the warmest clothes she owned. She bundled Charles in layers until he could barely move, securing him against her chest. Private Cooper appeared as she was mounting, pressing a rifle into her hands. Take this, he said. And this. He handed her a small pouch. Dried meat, matches, you'll need them. Thank you. Be careful out there. Mrs. Kensington, the plains in winter are unforgiving. She nodded and rode out through the gates. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Wind tore at her clothes, found every gap, every opening. Snow fell steadily, reducing visibility to mere yards. Jane guided Russ toward the creek where Shapa had first brought her, the only landmark she knew. It took hours to reach it. The cottonwoods stood bare and skeletal, their branches rattling in the wind. The creek was partially frozen, dark water running sluggishly beneath a skin of ice. She dismounted and looked around helplessly. How was she supposed to find one man in all this emptiness? She could wander for days and see nothing. Charles whimpered against her chest, cold despite the layers. She needed shelter. A plan. Something. Then she remembered. Shapa had said the land was his companion, that he lived in the old ways. She closed her eyes and tried to think like him. Where would he go in winter? Somewhere sheltered from wind, near water, with game nearby. Her eyes opened. There, to the north, a line of bluffs rose from the plains, dark stone cutting through white snow. Caves, perhaps. Shelter. She mounted again and rode toward them. The journey took the rest of the daylight. By the time she reached the bluffs, dusk was falling and the temperature had dropped brutally. Her fingers were numb despite gloves. Charles had stopped fussing, gone ominously quiet. She needed to find shelter immediately, or they would both freeze. She found a narrow opening in the rock face, barely wide enough for the horse. She dismounted and led Rust inside. The cave extended back into darkness, but it was dry and blocked the wind. Jane gathered what little dry wood she could find near the entrance, her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike the matches. On the third try, a flame caught. She built the fire carefully, nursing it until it burned steadily. Heat began to fill the small space. She unwrapped Charles and checked him frantically. His lips were blue, his skin cold. She rubbed his hands and feet, breathing warm air on them, tucking him inside her coat against her bare skin. Slowly, color returned to his face. He began to cry, weak but alive. Jane sobbed with relief. She fed him, then ate a little dried meat herself, forcing it down though she had no appetite. Outside, full darkness had fallen. Wind shrieked across the bluffs. Snow continued to fall. She had no idea if Shapa was even in this area, if he would see her fire, if he was alive at all. She might have risked everything for nothing. She added wood to the fire and settled against the cave wall with Charles in her arms. She would rest a few hours, then search at first light. It was all she could do. Sometime deep in the night, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Her eyes flew open. A figure stood at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the lesser darkness outside. Tall, broad-shouldered. Her heart hammered. She reached for the rifle, her hands clumsy with sleep and fear. "Jane Kensington," a familiar voice said quietly. "Shapa?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. He stepped into the firelight, and she saw his face. The same serious expression, the same dark eyes. Snow dusted his hair and shoulders. He carried a bow and a dead rabbit. "I saw your fire from the ridge," he said. "Few would be foolish enough to be out in this storm." "I thought I should see who." "It's Tommy Simmons," Jane said, the words tumbling out. "A boy at the fort. He's dying of fever. The doctor needs an herb, something that grows near water, with small white flowers and bitter roots. Mrs. Hartley said your people would know." "Please, I know it's asking too much, but he's just a child." Shapa held up a hand, stopping her. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "I know this plant. It grows even in winter, near warm springs. There is such a place, half a day's ride from here. Will you take me there?" "No," he said firmly. "You will stay here with your son. The journey is dangerous, and you are already half frozen. I will go and return by tomorrow night, but this is not a discussion," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You came to find me. You found me. Now let me do what needs to be done." Jane wanted to protest, but she was exhausted and cold, and he was right. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." Shapa moved to the fire and added the rabbit to it, showing her how to position it to cook properly. Then he stood. "Keep the fire burning. Do not leave this cave until I return. There are wolves in these hills, and the storm will get worse before it improves. Please be careful," Jane said. He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "You rode into a winter storm alone to save a child who's not your own. You are either very brave or very foolish. Probably both," Jane admitted. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Then he was gone, disappearing into the snow-filled darkness like a spirit. Jane sat alone with Charles and the crackling fire, staring at the cave entrance. She prayed, not to the stern God of her childhood, but to whatever forces governed this wild land. That Shapa would return safely, that Tommy Simmons would live, that her foolish bravery would amount to something more than frozen bodies in a cave. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Jane kept the fire burning, melted snow for water, forced herself to eat. Charles was fussy, sensing her tension. She sang to him, the same hymns she always sang, her voice echoing strangely off the stone walls. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, she waited. Night fell again. Still no Shapa. Jane's worry deepened into fear. What if he had gotten lost, injured? What if she had sent him to his death? The thought made her sick. Then near midnight, she heard it. The soft sound of a horse outside. Footsteps. Shapa appeared at the cave entrance, covered in snow, his face drawn with exhaustion. But in his hand, he held a cloth bundle. "The herb," he said simply. Crossing to her and placing it in her hands, Jane unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside were roots, pale and twisted, and dried leaves. The smell was sharp medicinal. "This is it?" "Yes. Boil the roots in water until the liquid turns dark. Give the child small amounts every few hours. The fever will break within a day if he is strong enough." "Thank you," Jane breathed. "Thank you so much." Shapa nodded and moved to the fire, extending his hands toward the warmth. He was shaking slightly, though he tried to hide it. Jane acted without thinking. She moved to him and took his hands, rubbing them between hers, trying to restore circulation. He stiffened, surprised, but didn't pull away. "You're freezing," she said. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning. That's not acceptable." She moved to her pack and pulled out the last of her dried meat and hardtack. Eat. That's an order. He raised an eyebrow. You give orders now? When people risk their lives for children and then try to pretend they're not half dead from cold and hunger. Yes, I give orders. That smile again, faint but real. He took the food and ate slowly, methodically. Jane boiled water and made weak tea from some herbs in her pack. She handed him the cup. He accepted it, their fingers brushing. Neither pulled away immediately. Why did you really come out here? Shapa asked quietly. You could have sent soldiers. You did not need to risk yourself. The soldiers wouldn't have looked for you, Jane said. They would have declared it impossible and let Tommy die. I couldn't do that, because you are stubborn, because it was right, she corrected. You taught me that. When you saved Charles and me, you showed me that doing the right thing matters more than following rules or staying safe. Shapa looked at her for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his scarred face. You learned that lesson too well, he said softly. Maybe, Jane agreed. Or maybe I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be. The storm broke the next morning. Jane woke to sunlight streaming through the cave entrance and silence. Blessed silence after days of howling wind. Shapa was already awake, preparing his horse. The way back to the fort will be passable now, he said. Jane stood, brushing off her skirt. Will you come with me? The people at the fort should know what you've done. They should thank you, he shook his head. Your colonel made his feelings about my people clear. I will not go where I am not welcome. Then I'll tell them, Jane said firmly. I'll make them understand. Understanding is not given, Jane Kensington. It is earned slowly through countless small actions. One herb will not change years of hatred. Then it's a start, she insisted. Shapa studied her, then nodded slowly. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps small actions matter more than I believed. He helped her mount Rust, handed up Charles, made sure they were securely positioned. Then he walked beside them as they descended from the bluffs, leading them back toward the plains. At the edge of the open ground, he stopped. I will go no further, he said. Jane looked down at him from the saddle. When will I see you again? When paths cross, he said, the same answer as before. But this time, his eyes held something different. Promise, perhaps. Or hope, I'll be looking for those crossings, Jane said softly. As will I, he replied. She rode away, glancing back once to see him standing alone against the white landscape, a dark figure in an endless field of snow. Then she turned toward the fort and urged Rust into a trot. She arrived at the gates near midday. Guards rushed to meet her, astonished. Mrs. Kensington, we thought you were dead. I'm fine, she said, sliding from the saddle. Where's Dr. Whitmore? I have the herb. She was led immediately to the doctor's quarters, where Tommy Simmons lay in a narrow bed, his mother weeping beside him. The boy's skin was gray, his breathing barely perceptible. Jane handed the bundle to Whitmore. Boil the roots until the water turns dark, she said, repeating Shapa's instructions. Give him small amounts every few hours. Whitmore looked skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. Within an hour, the first dose was prepared. Tommy's mother coaxed it between his lips. They waited. By evening, the boy's fever had dropped. By the next morning, he was conscious and asking for food. By the third day, he was sitting up and complaining about being confined to bed. The fort erupted in relief and celebration. Colonel Davison summoned Jane to his office. She went, carrying Charles, her heart steady. The colonel stood behind his desk, his expression conflicted. You disobeyed direct orders, he said. I saved a child's life, Jane replied calmly. You fraternized with Indians. I asked for help from a man who knows this land better than any of us. A man who risked his life in a winter storm to gather medicine for a boy he's never met. A man who showed more humanity than anyone in this fort, The colonel's jaw tightened. "You're walking a dangerous line, Mrs. Kensington." "Then court-martial me," Jane said, her voice steady and clear. "Send me away. But know this, Colonel Davison. That Dakota man, Shapa, he embodies every virtue you claim to defend. Honor, courage, selflessness. And if you can't see that, then perhaps you're the one who needs to reconsider his position." Silence filled the office. The colonel stared at her, clearly unused to being challenged, especially by a woman. Then slowly he sat down. "Get out," he said quietly. "Before I do something I regret." Jane turned and left, her head high. That evening, Tommy Simmons' mother found her in the kitchens. The woman embraced her, weeping. "Thank you," she said over and over. "Thank you for saving my boy." "Thank Shapa," Jane said gently. "He's the one who found the herb." "Then I thank him too," Mrs. Simmons said. "And I'll make sure everyone knows what he did." Word spread quickly through the fort. The story of the Dakota warrior who had braved a winter storm to save a white child became legend. Opinions shifted, slowly but perceptibly. Not everyone changed their minds, but some did. Private Cooper told anyone who would listen that not all Indians were enemies. Mrs. Hartley admitted, grudgingly, that perhaps she had judged too harshly. Even some of the soldiers began to question the rigid divisions they had accepted without thought. And Jane, standing in her small cabin that night with Charles asleep in her arms.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Looked out at the dark plains beyond the fort walls and smiled. Paths were crossing, change was coming, and she was ready. Spring arrived like a benediction, slow and sure. The snow melted into rushing streams. Grass pushed through thawed earth, turning the plains green and gold. Birds returned in vast flocks, filling the sky with sound and motion. The fort came alive with renewed energy after the long winter. Gardens were planted. Repairs were made to buildings damaged by ice and wind. Children played in the sunshine, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. Jane worked in the gardens now, her hands in the soil, planting beans and squash and corn. Charles, now walking with confidence, toddled between the rows, collecting pebbles and examining bugs with intense fascination. The kitchen work had been quietly reassigned to another woman, a recent arrival, and Jane suspected Mrs. Hartley's influence in the change. The older woman had softened toward her considerably since the winter, though she would never admit it outright. It was mid-April when the trading party arrived. A group of Dakota men and women came to the fort under a white flag, seeking to trade furs and beadwork for flour, sugar, and metal tools. Colonel Davison, under pressure from his superiors to maintain peaceful relations, allowed them entry. A designated area near the south gate was set up for the exchange. Soldiers watched nervously, hands near their weapons. But the Dakota moved calmly, spreading their wares on blankets, speaking quietly among themselves. Jane heard about it from Private Cooper, who found her in the garden. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "Trading parties here. About 15 of them." Her heart quickened. "Is he among them?" Cooper shrugged. "Don't know who you're looking for specifically, but you could come see for yourself." Jane wiped her hands on her apron, scooped up Charles, and followed Cooper to the trading area. A crowd had gathered, townspeople and soldiers alike, curious and wary in equal measure. Jane pushed through gently until she could see. The Dakota were impressive in their dignity. The women wore beautifully decorated dresses, elk hide adorned with intricate quillwork and beads. The men wore leggings and shirts, their hair long and carefully braided. They met the stares of the crowd with calm, unreadable faces. Jane scanned each one, her breath held. He wasn't there. Disappointment settled heavy in her chest. She turned to leave, but then one of the Dakota women looked up and their eyes met. The woman was older, perhaps 50, with silver threading through her black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She rose gracefully and walked directly to Jane, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. "You are the one called Jane," the woman said in careful English. Jane blinked, startled. "Yes, how did you know?" "Shapa spoke of you. The woman with the child who walks with courage." "I am Winona, his aunt." Jane's heart lurched. "Is he well? Is he safe?" Winona's expression softened slightly. "He is well. He lives as he chooses, in the old ways. But he speaks of you when he visits our fires. This is unusual for him. He does not speak of people." "I've been hoping to see him again," Jane admitted quietly. "To thank him properly for what he did." Winona studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Gratitude is given through actions, not words. You have shown this already." "Shapa knows. Then why hasn't he come?" "Because he is afraid," Winona said simply. "Not of soldiers or danger, but of wanting something he believes he cannot have." Before Jane could respond, a commotion erupted behind them. Raised voices, angry and sharp. Jane turned to see 3 soldiers confronting a young Dakota man near the blankets of trade goods. One soldier, a corporal named Hayes who Jane knew had a reputation for cruelty, was pointing at a decorated knife. "This is army issue," Hayes snarled. "Where'd you steal it from?" The young Dakota man shook his head, speaking in his own language, his tone respectful but firm. An older Dakota man stepped forward, translating. "He says he traded for it 2 winters ago at Fort Pierre. It is his property. Like hell it is," Hayes said, and grabbed the knife. The young man reached to take it back, and Hayes shoved him hard. The Dakota stumbled, caught himself. Tension crackled through the air. Other Dakota men stepped forward. Soldiers raised their rifles. The crowd fell silent, balanced on the knife's edge of violence. Jane didn't think. She stepped between them, Charles on her hip, her voice clear and firm. "Corporal Hayes, stand down." Hayes glared at her. "This ain't your concern, Mrs. Kensington. A man's property is being taken without cause. That makes it everyone's concern. If he says he traded for it, then he traded for it. Or are you calling him a liar without proof?" "I don't need proof." "He's Indian. He's a human being," Jane said, her voice cutting. "And he's here under a flag of truce, which you're violating. Put the knife back, or I'll report this to Colonel Davis and myself." Hayes' face flushed red. "You threatening me?" "I'm telling you what's right," Jane said steadily. "Now put it back." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was suffocating. Then Private Cooper stepped forward, positioning himself beside Jane. "She's right, Hayes. Put it back. You're creating an incident over nothing." 2 other soldiers nodded and lowered their weapons slightly. Hayes, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, threw the knife onto the blanket with a curse. "This ain't over," he muttered, and stalked away. The crowd slowly dispersed, the crisis averted. The young Dakota man picked up his knife and nodded to Jane, speaking in his language. Winona translated. "He says you have a warrior's heart." Jane's hands were shaking, now that the confrontation was over. "I just did what was right." "Yes," Winona agreed. "And that is why Shapa spoke of you." The trading continued without further incident. When the Dakota prepared to leave that evening, Winona approached Jane once more. She pressed something into her hand, a small pouch of soft leather, decorated with tiny blue beads. "For you," she said. "Inside is sage. Burn it for protection and clarity. And know this, Jane who walks with courage. Shapa will come when his heart is ready. Be patient." Jane clutched the pouch. "Will you tell him I asked about him? That I'm grateful? She stopped, unsure how to finish. "I will tell him you spoke with a strong voice against injustice," Winona said. "That will matter more to him than any words of gratitude." The Dakota left as the sun set, disappearing into the grasslands like spirits. Jane stood at the gate long after they were gone, the leather pouch warm in her hand. That night, She burned a pinch of the sage as Winona had instructed. The smoke rose in delicate spirals, filling her small cabin with its sharp, clean scent. Charles watched with wide eyes, pointing at the smoke and babbling. Jane sat on her bed and allowed herself, for the first time, to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. She wanted to see Shapa again, not just to thank him, but because his absence left an emptiness she couldn't name. Because when she thought of strength and honor and quiet kindness, she thought of him. Because in a world that seemed determined to divide people into us and them, he had simply seen her as someone who needed help and had given it without hesitation. 2 weeks later, Colonel Davison called a meeting in the fort's central square. The entire population gathered, curious and concerned. The colonel stood on a platform, his expression grave. "I've received orders from the territorial government," he announced. "All Dakota people are to be confined to the reservation boundaries. Anyone found beyond those boundaries without explicit permission will be arrested and imprisoned. This order is effective immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded in approval. Others looked troubled. Jane felt sick. "Furthermore," Davison continued, "any civilian found aiding Indians in violation of this order will face charges of treason against the United States. This includes providing food, shelter, or information that might help them evade capture." The colonel's eyes found Jane in the crowd. The message was clear. After the meeting dispersed, Mrs. Hartley pulled Jane aside. "You need to be careful now," she said quietly. "The colonel is watching you. Don't give him a reason to make an example of you." "They're making prisoners of people who've done nothing wrong," Jane said. "I know," Mrs. Hartley replied, surprising her. "I don't agree with it either. But disagreeing and openly defying are different things." "You have Charles to think about," Jane nodded, but inside, anger burned. The new restrictions cast a pall over the fort. Patrols increased. Soldiers rode the boundaries daily, looking for violations. The tentative thaw in relations between the fort's inhabitants and the Dakota people froze over again. Fear replaced curiosity. Suspicion replaced tolerance. Jane continued her work, kept her head down, but her mind churned constantly. She thought of Shapa, living free in the wilderness he called home. Would he be captured? Imprisoned? The thought made her chest tight with anxiety. 3 weeks after the new orders, Jane was working in the garden when Charles suddenly toddled away from her, moving toward the fort's wall with surprising speed. "Charles, come back," she called, standing to follow him. That's when she saw it. A small cloth bundle tucked into a gap in the wooden palisade, visible only from certain angles. Her heart began to pound. She glanced around. No one was watching. She retrieved the bundle quickly, hiding it in her apron. Back in her cabin, she unwrapped it with trembling hands. Inside was dried venison, a handful of wild berries, and a small piece of birch bark. On the bark, drawn in charcoal, was a simple image. A crescent moon above a single pine tree. Jane's breath caught. It was a message, it had to be. But what did it mean? She studied the drawing, turning it over in her mind. A crescent moon. A lone pine tree. She had seen a solitary pine during her winter journey to find Shapa, standing on a ridge near the bluffs. Was he telling her to meet him there? But when? The crescent moon. She calculated quickly. The moon would be a crescent in 5 days. 5 days to decide if she would risk everything. She thought of Charles, of her position at the fort, of the colonel's warning. She thought of the word treason and what it meant. Prison. Losing her son. Everything she had fought to build. Then she thought of Shapa, alone in the wilderness, risking his own freedom to leave her a message. She thought of the man who had saved her life, who had ridden into a winter storm for a child he didn't know, who embodied every virtue she held dear. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. On the night of the crescent moon, Jane prepared carefully. She told Mrs. Hartley she wasn't feeling well and would be staying in her cabin. She bundled Charles warmly and waited until the fort grew quiet. Near midnight, she slipped out through a gap in the palisade that she had discovered weeks ago, a place where the wood had rotted and loosened. She carried Charles on her back in a sling and moved through shadows like a ghost. The walk to the lone pine took 2 hours. Her legs ached. Her arms trembled from carrying Charles. But she pressed on, guided by starlight and memory. Finally, she crested the ridge and saw it. The solitary pine, black against the star-filled sky. A figure stood beneath it. Jane's heart soared. She hurried forward, and as she drew close, Shapa stepped into the moonlight. His face was as serious as ever, but his eyes held warmth. "You came," he said quietly. "Did you doubt I would?" Jane asked, breathless. "Yes," he admitted. "What I ask of you is dangerous. You could lose everything." "I could lose more by not coming," Jane replied. They stood facing each other, the night vast and silent around them. Charles, awake now, reached out toward Shapa, making a happy gurgling sound. Shapa smiled, the expression transforming his face, and gently took the child's small hand. "I had to see you," Shapa said. "To tell you that what you did for my people at the trading, standing against that soldier, it mattered. Word has spread among the Dakota. You are known as friend who speaks truth. I only did what was right. Most people do not do what is right when it costs them something," Shapa said. "You are different, Jane Kensington. You have been different since the first moment I saw you, kneeling in the grass, protecting your child even though you believed you would die." Jane's throat tightened. "Why did you leave me that message? Why risk coming here?" Shapa was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I am tired of living only for survival. Because when I close my eyes, I see your face. Because I want to know if what I feel is only gratitude or something more. And what do you feel?" Jane whispered. He stepped closer. They were inches apart now. "I feel as though I have been walking in winter for years, and you are the first warm fire I have found." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "I feel the same way. Like I've been lost and didn't even know it until you appeared. This path we walk is dangerous," Shapa warned. "Your people will not accept it. Mine may not either. We will face hatred, rejection, perhaps worse." "I know," Jane said. "But I'm tired of letting fear decide my life. I'm tired of living in a world that tells me who I'm allowed to care about. If this is wrong, then let me be wrong. But let me choose it freely." Shapa reached up and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle. "Then choose, Jane Kensington. Choose now, knowing what it will cost." She leaned into his touch, her hand covering his. "I choose you," she said. "I choose this. Whatever comes." He kissed her then, softly at first, then deeper. Years of loneliness and longing pouring into that single moment. Jane felt something break open inside her, something she hadn't even known was locked away. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "What do we do now?" Jane asked. "We meet when we can," Shapa said. "Carefully, secretly, until the time comes when we no longer have to hide. And if that time never comes, then we will have stolen moments of truth in a world of lies," Shapa said. "And that will be enough," Jane nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of secrecy and separation. But this was the reality they faced. They stood together under the lone pine until the sky began to lighten in the east. Then, reluctantly, they separated. Shapa melted back into the wilderness. Jane returned to the fort, slipping through the gap in the wall just as the first soldiers began to stir. In her cabin, she lay down with Charles and closed her eyes. Her lips still tingled from Shapa's kiss. Her heart felt fuller than it had in years. She had chosen her path, and she would walk it, no matter where it led. Summer blazed across the Dakota Territory with relentless heat. The grasslands turned from green to gold, rippling like water under endless wind. Jane's secret meetings with Shapa became the rhythm of her life, a dangerous pattern of stolen hours beneath stars and whispered words in shadowed places. They met at the Lone Pine, at a dried creek bed where cottonwoods offered cover. Once even at the edge of a buffalo wallow where the land dipped low enough to hide them from distant eyes. Each time, the risk grew greater. Patrols had increased. Soldiers rode the perimeter at irregular intervals, searching for any sign of Dakota presence beyond the reservation. Jane learned to move like a shadow, to read the patterns of the guards, to time her departures when attention was focused elsewhere. Charles, now 18 months old, seemed to understand the need for silence during these journeys, nestling quietly against her as they slipped through darkness. Shapa taught her things during their meetings. How to read the sky for weather changes. Which plants could heal and which could kill. The names of constellations in Dakota, words that felt strange and beautiful on her tongue. He told her stories of his people, their history and losses, the way the world had been before the treaties and the reservations. She listened, memorizing every word, understanding that he was trusting her with pieces of himself he showed to no one else. In turn, she told him about her life before. Her childhood in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. Her marriage to Thomas, arranged more by circumstance than passion. The journey west that had ended in fever and death. She spoke of loneliness and duty, of feeling like she was living someone else's life, following a path laid out by others. And now? Shapa asked one night in late June as they sat together on a flat rock overlooking the plains, Charles asleep between them. Now I feel like I'm finally choosing, Jane said. Even if the choice is dangerous. Even if it costs me everything. It's mine. Shapa took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You are the bravest person I have known, he said quietly. I'm terrified every moment. Jane admitted. That is what makes it brave, he replied. But their careful pattern shattered on a sweltering afternoon in mid-July. Jane was returning from the garden, Charles toddling beside her, when she saw Corporal Hayes watching her from across the yard. His eyes were narrow, calculating. A chill ran down her spine despite the heat. Hayes had been hostile since the trading incident, making pointed comments when he passed her, finding excuses to question her movements. She had tried to avoid him, but the fort was small and avoidance only went so far. That evening, there was a knock on her cabin door. Jane opened it to find Private Cooper, his young face grave. Mrs. Kensington, I need to speak with you, he said quietly. She let him in, closing the door. What's wrong? Hayes has been watching you. He's convinced you're meeting someone outside the fort. He's talked to some of the other soldiers, tried to get them to spy on you. Most refused, but I'm worried he'll do something himself. Jane's blood ran cold. What do I do? Be more careful. Stay inside the fort for a while. I know that's not what you want to hear, but Hayes is looking for any excuse to cause trouble. If he catches you outside the walls, he'll report it as treason. The colonel might not have a choice but to arrest you. Jane nodded slowly. Thank you for warning me. Cooper hesitated at the door. Whatever you're doing, whoever you're seeing, I hope it's worth the risk. It is, Jane said softly. After he left, Jane sat in darkness, Charles asleep in her arms, her mind racing. She couldn't meet Shapa for a while, maybe weeks. But how would he know? He would come to their meeting place and find her absent. He might think she had changed her mind, that fear had won, that she had chosen safety over him. The thought was unbearable. 2 nights later, she made a decision. She would go one more time to explain, to tell Shapa about Hayes and the increased danger. Then she would stay within the fort until circumstances changed. It was the only way. She waited until well past midnight, later than usual. She checked the guards' positions from her window, noting their patterns. When the moment seemed right, she slipped out through the gap in the wall, Charles secured against her back. The walk to the Lone Pine took longer in the deeper darkness. Clouds covered the moon. She stumbled twice, catching herself against rocks, her heart pounding. Finally, she reached the ridge. The solitary pine stood black against the sky. And beneath it, waiting as always, was Shapa. He rose as she approached, and even in the darkness she could see the relief on his face. "Jane," he said, and the way he spoke her name was like a prayer. "I can't come again for a while," she said immediately, the words tumbling out. "A soldier suspects me. He's watching. It's too dangerous." Shapa's expression hardened. "Then we stop. We end this before you are caught." "No," Jane said fiercely. "Not stop. Just pause. Until things settle. Jane, listen to me." Shapa gripped her shoulders gently. "If you are caught, they will take Charles from you. They will put you in prison, or worse. I cannot allow that to happen. You don't get to decide what I risk," Jane said, her voice shaking. "This is my choice. My life. Your life affects more than just you now," Shapa argued. "Your son needs his mother. What good is our love if it destroys you?" The word hung between them. Love. Neither had spoken it before, though it had been present in every touch, every glance, every whispered conversation. Now it was real, undeniable. "Then come with me," Jane said suddenly. "Leave the territories. Go somewhere they don't know us, where we can be together without hiding." Shapa's face twisted with anguish. "I cannot leave this land. It is all that remains of my people's world. To abandon it would be to surrender everything we were, and I can't stay at the fort forever, living half a life, pretending you don't exist," Jane said, tears streaming down her face now. "So what do we do? How do we choose between love and survival?" Before Shapa could answer, a sound shattered the night. A gunshot, close and sharp. They both froze. Then voices shouting. Lights bobbing in the darkness. Soldiers, at least 4 of them, climbing the ridge toward them. "Run," Shapa said, pushing Jane behind him. "Not without you," she gasped. "They want me, not you. Say I forced you to come here. Say I threatened Charles. They will believe it. You will be safe." "I won't lie," Jane said. "Then we both hang," Shapa said harshly. "Is that what you want for your son? To watch his mother executed for treason?" The soldiers were closer now. Jane could hear Hayes' voice among them, triumphant and cruel. "I knew it. I knew she was meeting one of them." Shapa pulled Jane close, kissed her hard and desperate. "Forgive me," he whispered against her lips. Then he pushed her away and ran, not toward safety, but toward the soldiers, drawing their attention away from her. "There he is." Hayes shouted. "After him." The soldiers gave chase. Gunshots rang out. Jane screamed, but Shapa was already disappearing into the darkness, moving with the fluid grace of someone who knew every stone and shadow. The soldiers crashed after him, clumsy and loud. Within moments, they were all gone, swallowed by the night. Jane stood alone, trembling violently. Charles was crying now, frightened by the noise. She held him tight, trying to quiet him, her mind spinning. Had Shapa escaped? Was he hurt? Would they catch him? She had to get back to the fort before the soldiers returned. She ran, stumbling down the ridge, her breath ragged. She reached the gap in the wall and squeezed through, nearly falling in her haste. She made it to her cabin and barred the door, collapsing against it. An hour later, heavy footsteps approached. Fists pounded on her door. "Mrs. Kensington, open up." Jane composed herself as best she could and opened the door. Hayes stood there with 2 other soldiers, all 3 breathing hard and furious. "Where is he?" Hayes demanded. "Where is who?" Jane asked, her voice steady despite her terror. "Don't play games. We saw you on that ridge. We saw the Indian." "Where did he go?" "I don't know what you're talking about. I was checking on something I'd buried near the ridge, supplies for winter. I heard shouting and gunfire and came back immediately. You're a liar, Hayes snarled. You've been meeting with him for months. I know it. Everyone will know it. You have no proof, Jane said coldly. Only suspicions and hatred. Hayes stepped closer, his face inches from hers. I will find proof. And when I do, you'll hang. That's a promise. He left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. The next day, Jane was summoned to Colonel Davison's office. She went with her head high, Charles on her hip. The colonel sat behind his desk, his expression weary. Mrs. Kensington, Corporal Hayes has made serious accusations against you. Accusations based on nothing but his own prejudice, Jane said. He claims you were meeting with a Dakota man outside the fort. That you've been doing so for months. He claims many things. That doesn't make them true. Davison studied her. I want to believe you, Mrs. Kensington. You saved a child's life this winter. You've worked hard and caused no trouble. But if these accusations have merit, I have a duty to investigate. Investigate all you want, Jane said. You'll find nothing because there's nothing to find. I hope that's true, Davison said quietly. Because if it's not, I can't protect you. The territorial government is looking for examples to make. Don't give them one. Jane was dismissed but not reassured. She returned to her cabin and sat in darkness, her mind churning. Hayes would keep watching. Keep searching. Eventually, he might find something. A witness. A track. Some small piece of evidence. Days passed with excruciating slowness. Jane stayed within the fort, working in the gardens, caring for Charles, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But every night, she stood at her window and looked toward the plains, wondering where Shapa was, if he was safe, if he thought of her. 2 weeks after the incident on the ridge, a Dakota woman appeared at the fort gates asking for Jane by name. The guards were suspicious, but the woman was elderly and unarmed, so they allowed her to enter under escort. She was brought to the garden where Jane was working. It was Winona. Jane's heart leaped. She approached carefully, aware of the guards watching. Winona, she said quietly. It's good to see you, and you, friend who speaks truth, Winona replied. She reached into a pouch and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. I have medicine for you. Your son, he has been coughing, yes? Charles had been coughing slightly the past few days, nothing serious. Jane nodded slowly, understanding this was a pretense. Yes, thank you. Winona pressed the bundle into her hands. Their eyes met. The medicine must be prepared carefully, Winona said, her voice carrying a weight of meaning. Follow the instructions inside exactly. Do not deviate. I understand, Jane said. Winona nodded and left, escorted back to the gates by the guards. Jane waited until she was alone in her cabin before unwrapping the bundle. Inside was dried herbs, yes, but also a small piece of birch bark. On it, written in charcoal, were words in English. Shapa is safe. He watches from afar. He says your courage shamas the stars. He will wait for you however long it takes. Do not risk yourself again. Love endures in patience. Jane pressed the bark to her chest and wept, silently so no one would hear. Relief and grief and love tangled together until she couldn't separate one from the other. The summer dragged on. Hayes continued his surveillance, but without evidence, he could do nothing. The fort settled into uneasy routine. Jane worked, cared for Charles, and waited. Waited for circumstances to change, for opportunities to open, for a future that seemed impossibly distant. Then, in late August, word came that shocked the entire territory, a new policy from Washington. The reservation boundaries were being redrawn, expanded to include more hunting grounds. Dakota people would be allowed limited travel beyond those boundaries for traditional purposes, monitored but not forbidden. It wasn't freedom, but it was a crack in the wall, more than that. There was talk of a new fort commander coming, a man known for his more progressive views on Indian relations. Colonel Davison would be reassigned. The change would happen in the fall. Jane felt hope stir for the first time in months. One evening in early September, as she was putting Charles to bed, there was a soft scratching at her window. Her heart stopped. She went to it slowly and pulled back the curtain. Shapa stood outside in the shadows, barely visible. He pressed his hand against the glass. She pressed hers to match it, separated by the thin barrier. They stood that way for a long moment, drinking in the sight of each other. Then he was gone, fading into the night like smoke, but the message was clear. He was still there, still waiting, still believing in a future where they didn't have to hide. Jane climbed into bed beside Charles and closed her eyes. She didn't know how long it would take. Months, maybe years. But she would wait. She would endure. She would fight for the right to choose her own path, to love whom she chose, to live a life of truth rather than fear. Because some things were worth any risk, and love, real love, the kind that saw past difference and division to the human soul beneath, was worth everything. Fort Randall, Dakota Territory. September 1879. The leaves on the cottonwoods had turned gold, catching the afternoon sun like flames. A year had passed since the night Shapa had pressed his hand to Jane's window, since haze had chased shadows on a dark ridge, since love had become both a promise and a patience. The fort looked much the same, its wooden walls weathered by another cycle of seasons. But everything within those walls had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The new commander, Colonel Benjamin Marsh, had arrived in October of the previous year with policies that startled the hardened soldiers under his command. He believed in what he called practical peace, a recognition that the Dakota people were not vanishing and that coexistence required more than treaties, written in Washington by men who had never set foot on the plains. He established regular trading days, hired Dakota scouts to work alongside army trackers, and most remarkably, he invited tribal elders to monthly councils where grievances could be aired and solutions proposed. It was revolutionary. It was fragile, but it was real. Jane had watched these changes with cautious hope, never pushing, never drawing attention to herself. Hayes had been transferred to a post in Kansas, much to everyone's relief, and with him gone, the atmosphere at the fort had lightened considerably. She continued her work in the gardens, which had expanded under her care into something remarkable. Rows of beans, squash, corn, and medicinal herbs now flourished where once only weeds had grown. Other women had joined her effort, and what had begun as simple survival had become a kind of community. Charles was nearly 2.5 now, speaking in full sentences, running everywhere on sturdy legs, asking endless questions about everything he saw. He had his father's dark hair and Jane's pale blue eyes, and a personality entirely his own, curious and fearless and kind. Jane watched him grow with wonder and occasional terror, amazed that this small person had survived everything they had endured together. It was late September when Winona appeared at the fort gates again. This time not alone, but with a small delegation. 5 Dakota people, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in their finest clothing, approached under the white flag of peaceful intent. They asked specifically to speak with Colonel Marsh and, surprisingly, with Jane Kensington. Word spread quickly through the fort. Jane was in the garden when Private Cooper found her, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Kensington, the colonel wants to see you in his office." "There are Dakota visitors, and they've asked for you by name," Jane's heart hammered. She wiped her hands on her apron, scooped up Charles, and followed Cooper across the yard. Curious faces watched from doorways and windows. She held her head high, refusing to show the anxiety churning in her stomach. Inside the colonel's office, Winona stood with the other Dakota visitors. Colonel Marsh sat behind his desk, looking intrigued rather than hostile. He gestured to a chair. "Mrs. Kensington, please sit. These visitors have brought an interesting proposal." Jane sat, settling Charles on her lap. Her eyes found Winona's. The older woman's expression was calm, but something flickered in her gaze. Recognition. Respect. Colonel Marsh leaned back in his chair. Winona here serves as a liaison between her people and several forts in the territory. She's been instrumental in maintaining peace. She's proposed something I've never heard before, but I'm inclined to consider it. Winona stepped forward and spoke, her English clear and measured. My people wish to establish a school near the reservation boundary. A place where Dakota children can learn the white man's words and numbers, but also where white children can learn our language, our history, our ways. A bridge between worlds. Jane's breath caught. It was audacious, impossible, brilliant, Marsh continued. She's asked if you would be willing to teach there. Mrs. Kensington. She says you are trusted by her people, that you have shown respect and courage. She believes you could help make such a school successful. Jane's mind reeled. Teach at a school between worlds. Leave the fort. Live on the boundary between Dakota land and white settlement. It would be dangerous, controversial, many would oppose it. But it would also be purpose, meaning, a chance to build something new. Why me? Jane asked Winona directly. Because you see people, not sides, Winona replied. Because you have walked between worlds and survived. Because my nephew speaks of you as one who chooses truth over comfort. There it was. The acknowledgement, subtle but clear, that Winona knew about Jane and Shapa. That this proposal was not just about education, but about creating a space where the impossible might become possible. I would need to think about it, Jane said carefully. And I would need assurances about safety for myself and my son. Of course, Marsh said. This would be an official position, sanctioned by both the Army and the Tribal Council. You would have protection and support. But I'll be honest, Mrs. Kensington, there will be resistance. From both sides. Some of my soldiers will think you're a traitor. Some of Winona's people will think she's surrendering their children to white influence. This won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Jane said quietly. Marsh smiled slightly. I like you, Mrs. Kensington. You've got steel in you. Take a few days to consider. But I hope you'll say yes. I think this could be important. The meeting ended. As Jane was leaving, Winona touched her arm. Walk with me a moment, she said. They stepped outside, moving away from listening ears. Winona spoke softly. The school would be at the place where Clear Creek meets the bluffs. Do you know this place? Jane's heart skipped. She knew it. It was less than 2 miles from the Lone Pine, from the places where she and Shapa had met in secret. I know it, she whispered. Good, Winona said. Then you understand what I am offering. Not just a school, but a life. A future. The chance to stop hiding. Does he know about this? Jane asked. It was his idea, Winona replied. He brought it to our council. He said the children need teachers who understand both worlds. He said you are that teacher. He did not speak of his feelings, but we are not blind. We see. Jane's eyes filled with tears. Your people would accept this? Accept us? Some will. Some will not. That is the nature of change. But Shapa is respected among us. He is called Silent Wolf because he moves between worlds without losing himself. If he chooses you, many will trust his judgment. And those who do not will learn, in time or they will not. We cannot control everyone's heart. What about Charles? Jane asked. He's young, but he'll grow up between these worlds. It won't be easy for him. Nothing about his life has been easy, Winona observed. Yet look at him, strong, curious, loved. You have given him a foundation. Now give him a bridge. Jane looked down at Charles, who was tugging at her skirt, pointing at a bird. She thought about the life she could offer him here at the fort, safe but limited, surrounded by walls both physical and invisible. Then she thought about the life she could offer him at the school, Dangerous but free, surrounded by open sky and the possibility of something new. I need to speak with him, Jane said. With Shapa. Before I decide, Winona nodded. Tomorrow night. The full moon. Come to the Lone Pine. He will be there. The next evening, Jane made her preparations carefully. She told Mrs. Hartley she was taking Charles for a walk to tire him out before bed. The older woman had grown fond of Jane over the past year and asked no difficult questions. Jane bundled Charles warmly and walked out through the fort gates openly this time, no longer sneaking through gaps in walls. Colonel Marsh's new policies allowed civilians to travel short distances from the fort during daylight. And though the sun was setting, no one stopped her. She reached the Lone Pine as the moon rose, huge and silver. And there, as promised, was Shapa. He looked the same and yet different. His face had more lines, evidence of a hard year. But his eyes, when they met hers, held everything she had been feeling: longing, hope, love that had endured through silence and separation. Jane, he said, and crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. They came together with the desperate intensity of 2 people who had been denied touch for too long. The kiss was fierce and sweet and tasted like freedom. Charles, caught between them, laughed and patted both their faces. They broke apart, breathless, and Shapa lifted the boy into his arms. He has grown, Shapa said, his voice rough with emotion. He asks about you, Jane said. I've told him stories. I call you the friend who helped us when we were lost. He wants to meet you properly, and now he can, Shapa said, looking at Charles with such tenderness that Jane's heart ached. If you accept the school, if you choose this path, tell me what it would mean, Jane said. Really mean. Not just the pretty vision of children learning together, but the reality. The dangers. The challenges. Shapa set Charles down carefully, letting the boy toddle around exploring. Then he took Jane's hands. It will be hard, he said honestly. There will be people on both sides who hate what we represent. We will face insults, threats, perhaps violence. Your son will grow up knowing he is different, that his family does not fit the world's expectations. There will be times when we question whether we made the right choice. But, Jane prompted, but we will be together, Shapa said simply. We will build something that matters. We will show our children, yours and the ones we teach, that different worlds can touch without one destroying the other. We will prove that love is stronger than fear, that courage is found in small daily choices, not just grand gestures. We will be free, Jane, truly free. Not because we hide or pretend, but because we refuse to let others' hatred define us. Jane looked at him, this man who had saved her life and then, slowly, taught her how to live it. She thought about the girl she had been a year and a half ago, kneeling in a general store, being traded for a sack of flour, believing she was worthless. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger, who had learned that worth was not given by others but claimed by oneself. Yes, she said. Yes to the school. Yes to this life. Yes to you. Yes to all of it. Shapa pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She felt his shoulders shake and realized he was crying silently. She held him, this strong man who had carried so much alone for so long, and let her own tears fall freely. When? She asked eventually. The school will be ready by late October, Shapa said. Winona and others have been building it in secret for months. Small but solid. Room for teaching, room for living. It waits only for you. Then I'll come in October, Jane said. I'll give Colonel Marsh my answer tomorrow. I'll prepare Charles. I'll say goodbye to the few friends I've made. And then we'll start our new life. They spent hours talking that night, making plans, discussing details, simply existing together after so long apart. Charles eventually fell asleep on a blanket Shapa had brought, and they sat beside him, hands clasped, watching the moon trek across the sky. "I was afraid you would change your mind," Shapa admitted quietly. "That the waiting would be too much. That you would find someone easier, someone who fit your world better." "There's no one easier," Jane said. "And I don't want easy. I want true. I want you, even knowing what it will cost?" He asked. "Especially knowing what it will cost," Jane replied. "Because something that costs nothing is worth nothing. You taught me that." As dawn approached, they separated reluctantly. Shapa kissed her one more time, long and slow, a promise of all the kisses to come. Then he disappeared into the early light, and Jane walked back to the fort with Charles sleeping against her shoulder. She gave Colonel Marsh her answer that morning. He was pleased and immediately began making arrangements. The news spread quickly through the fort. Reactions were mixed. Mrs. Hartley was supportive, surprisingly. "You've got courage, Jane Kensington," she said. "More than I ever did. Make something good out there." Private Cooper shook her hand. "You're doing a brave thing," he said. "The world needs more people like you." Others were less kind. Some women stopped speaking to her. Some soldiers muttered darkly about Indian lovers and traitors. Jane ignored them. She had made her choice, and their opinions no longer held power over her. The weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Jane packed her few belongings, said her goodbyes, spent long hours with Charles, explaining that they were moving to a new home, a special place where he would learn many wonderful things. The boy listened with wide eyes and asked if the friend from Mama's stories would be there. Jane said yes, he would be there always. On a crisp October morning, Jane walked out of Fort Randall for the last time. Colonel Marsh provided a wagon and an escort to take her to the school. Winona met them at the boundary, along with several Dakota families whose children would attend. And standing beside the newly built schoolhouse, simple but sturdy with a stone fireplace and real glass windows, was Shapa. Jane climbed down from the wagon, Charles in her arms. She walked to Shapa and stopped before him. The Dakota families watched. The army escort watched. Everyone was silent, waiting to see what would happen. Shapa reached out and took Charles from her arms, lifting the boy high. Charles laughed, delighted. Then Shapa lowered him and offered his hand to Jane. She took it. They stood there, hands clasped, before all these witnesses, making their choice visible and undeniable. "Welcome home," Shapa said softly. "Home," Jane repeated. And the word had never felt more true. The school opened a week later. 7 Dakota children and 3 white children from nearby homesteads attended that first day. Jane taught them letters and numbers in the morning. In the afternoon, Shapa taught them to identify plants and track animals. The children were wary of each other at first, divided by language and culture and all the weight of history. But children are resilient, and curiosity eventually overcame fear. Within a month, they were playing together during breaks, teaching each other words, laughing at shared jokes. Jane and Shapa built a life together beside the school. They married in a Dakota ceremony in November, with Winona presiding and the students as witnesses. Some of Jane's former acquaintances from the fort attended, though others stayed away. Some of Shapa's relatives came, though others refused. It didn't matter. The people who mattered were there. Charles thrived in this new world. He learned to speak both English and Dakota fluently. He learned to read and write, but also to read tracks and weather patterns. He grew up surrounded by children from 2 cultures, absorbing the best of both. When he asked Jane one day why his family was different from others, she knelt and looked him in the eyes. "We're different because we choose to be," she said. "Because we believe love is stronger than fear, and that different people can live together if they're brave enough to try. You get to grow up knowing 2 worlds, Charles. That's not a burden. That's a gift." The school grew. By the second year, 15 children attended. By the third, 22. Other teachers joined them, both white and Dakota. building on the foundation Jane and Shapa had established. The school became known throughout the territory, controversial but undeniable in its success. Children who attended went on to become translators, traders, teachers themselves, bridges between worlds. Jane and Shapa had 2 more children over the years, daughters who grew up running wild across the plains, equally comfortable in buckskin or calico. The family was not always accepted, not always welcome in either world. There were hard times. Times when hatred flared and threats were made. Times when Jane wondered if they had made the right choice, if the cost to their children was too high. But then she would see Charles teaching a younger Dakota child to write their name, or watch her daughters playing a game that blended both cultures, or feel Shapa's hand in hers as they stood together watching the sunset. And she would know they had chosen correctly, not because it was easy, not because everyone approved, but because it was true, because they had refused to let fear or prejudice or the weight of history dictate their lives, because they had dared to imagine something different and then had the courage to build it. On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years after the school had opened, Jane stood at the door of their home watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Charles was inside helping his sisters with their studies. Shapa was repairing a fence nearby. The school stood solid and welcoming behind them. Students' laughter drifted on the wind. Winona approached, older now but still strong. She stood beside Jane, both women watching the light fade. "You have done well," Winona said. "We've done well," Jane corrected. "All of us together. Do you ever regret it?" Winona asked. "The choice you made? The life you left behind?" Jane thought about Fort Randall, about the safety of walls and the comfort of fitting in. Then she thought about this life, difficult and beautiful and entirely her own. She thought about Shapa and their children and the students who were learning to walk between worlds without losing themselves. "I regret nothing," Jane said firmly. "I was traded for a sack of flour once. I let myself believe I was worthless. Then a Dakota warrior showed me I was wrong. He didn't save me. He gave me the chance to save myself. And I did. We did. We're still doing it every day." Winona nodded slowly. "The children call you teacher who bridges worlds," she said. "It is a good name. What do they call Shapa?" Jane asked. "Still silent Wolf," Winona replied with a slight smile. "But now they add, who found his voice. He speaks more now than he ever did." "You have changed him too. We've changed each other," Jane said. "That's how love works when it's real." As darkness fell, Shapa finished his work and came to stand beside Jane. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, solid and warm and home. They stood that way as stars emerged, one by one, filling the vast Dakota sky. "Do you remember the first night?" Jane asked quietly. "After the stampede? When we camped by the creek and you kept watch while I slept?" "I remember," Shapa said. "Did you know then?" She asked. "That we would end up here?" "No," Shapa admitted. "I thought only about keeping you alive. I did not imagine war was possible, but it was," Jane said. "Because you dared to imagine it," Shapa replied. "Because you refused to accept the world as it was and insisted on building the world as it should be." Jane turned in his arms to face him. "We built it together," she said. "And we'll keep building it. For our children. For all the children. For everyone brave enough to believe that love can bridge any divide." Shapa kissed her then, tender and sure. And in that kiss was everything they had survived, everything they had built, everything they would continue to create together. Two people from different worlds who had dared to choose each other, who had refused to let hatred win, who had proven that courage and love were stronger than fear. Inside the house, their children called for them. The evening meal was ready. The family gathered together, speaking both English and Dakota, laughing at shared jokes, planning tomorrow's lessons. Outside, the plain stretched endless under stars. And somewhere in that vastness, other people were watching those same stars and perhaps daring to imagine their own impossible dreams. Jane Kensington had been traded for a sack of flour once. She had been told she was worthless. She had believed it for a time, but a Dakota warrior named Shapa had shown her the truth. Not through grand gestures or pretty words, but through simple, consistent respect. Through seeing her as a person, not a possession. Through offering choice, not commands. Through demonstrating that worth was inherent, not earned, and Jane had learned. Had grown. Had claimed her own value and built a life that reflected it. A life of purpose and meaning and love that transcended the boundaries others tried to impose. It was not an easy life. It would never be easy, but it was hers, and that made it worth everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.